So we have an excellent panel now on the role of the youth in, I just want to get the exact title, yes, the role of the youth movements and NGOs after the coup. And we have only 3 panelists. One of the panelists was not able to attend in the end, as I mentioned before. I'll introduce them now, and then they'll just speak one after the other. Mohammed Abbas was a leading member of the Revolution Youth Coalition, which represents the 5 main youth groups that started and led the Egyptian Revolution of January 25th, 2011. He's a former member of the High Committee of the Egyptian Current, which is Al-Tayar al-Masri Party. He ran for parliament in 2011 and was a member of the Justice and Citizenship Committee in the same year. Professionally, Mohammed Abbas is a research assistant in Arabic at the Arabic Center for Research and Policy Studies and a member of the advisory board of the ESCWA report on the Arab world. And on my copy, I wrote what ESCWA means, and I can't remember. Something to do with the UN, right?
ESCWA.
Yeah, I can't remember. You can look it up. It's a lot of work. ESCWA in the Arab world through 2025. The second presenter is Maryam Jamshidi, who is a local Washingtonian and the founder of Muftah, a digital magazine on the Middle East and North Africa. She's the author of The Future of the Arab Spring, Civic Entrepreneurship in Politics, Art, and Technology Startups, which was published in 2013. Maryam is a lawyer and writer with 10 years of professional experience working on issues relating to the Middle East and North Africa and related diaspora communities in the United States. She's written on transitional justice in the region for academic volumes in various media outlets and has represented Middle East governments and state-owned companies in both judicial and diplomatic settings. She's a lawyer, in case any of you need that. She has a JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School, she's a good lawyer, and a master's degree in political theory from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a bachelor degree in political science from Brown University, very impressive, no relation to me, and she's based in Washington, D.C. Islam Lutfi Shalabi is a lawyer and prominent member of the Revolutionary Youth Council. He was formerly a leader in the youth wing of the Muslim Brotherhood and the youth representative to the RYC. In June 2011, Lutfi, along with a number of former Muslim Brotherhood youth and members of the RIC, including Mohammed Al-Qassas, Ahmed Abdul Gawad, Hani Mahmoud, and Mohammed Affan, founded the Egyptian Current Party, Tayar al-Masri. After founding the party, Lutfi was expelled from the Muslim Brotherhood in July 2011, along with other Muslim Brotherhood members who chose to join political parties other than the Freedom and Justice Party in order to support Abdel Menem Abdel Fattah's presidential campaign. Prior to January 2011, Lutfi was well known for his political activism and his blog, Kawkabi. And Mohammed Abbas and Islam Lutfi will be speaking Arabic, and then I'll be doing my best to translate. So they'll speak for a bit, and then I'll translate, and then they'll speak for it. It won't be simultaneous. So we'll start. Why don't we start with Mohammed Abbas? تفضل.
مساء الخير. السؤال دلوقتي بيتم طرحه، هبدأ من النهاية للبداية. دلوقتي هل في تمكين للشباب في مصر بعد ثورة الشباب في 25 يناير أم لا؟ بالطبع في تمكين للشباب، بس شباب ثورة 19 من ثورة 2011. This is the problem.
Okay. This is a time of potential and empowerment for the youth. There was a time now as it was after in the time of revolution of 2011. صح؟
Okay.
That was a joke? Or was that serious?
1919 revolution youth. الثورة المصرية انتقلت في عدة مراحل. المرحلة الأولى هي تنحي مبارك. المرحلة دي كان الخيار الخطأ الذي اتخذه الشباب في هذه اللحظة هو اختيار أن يترك المجلس العسكري مهمة إدارة البلاد. كان في حالة من المثالية الزائدة عند شباب الثورة في البعد والهروب من المسؤولية، حيث لا يقال أنهم يريدون السلطة في هذه اللحظة.
So during this period, this revolution has passed through many periods. The first period being Mubarak's resignation. At that point, the youth made a mistake, which was namely to let the kind of surrender the stage to the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, to let them rule. And this was because there was sort of a desire to not appear to be wanting power. They wanted to sort of not be longing for authority and power themselves.
دي المحطة الأولى. المحطة الثانية كانت استفتاء الدستور في شهر مارس 2011، ودي المرحلة اللي بدأ فيها تقسيم الثورة المصرية بشكل حقيقي. كان يجب على الشباب بعد أن كان عندهم خارطة طريق واضحة إجبار المجلس العسكري على خارطة طريق، ولكن المجلس العسكري صمم على خارطة طريق ليصل في هذه اللحظة لما نحن عليه. في 19 مارس 2011 تم الاستفتاء الذي قسم المصريين بين العلمانيين والإسلاميين. غالبية الشباب كان موقفهم من الدستور دوت لا، ولكن لم يستطيعوا أن يحشدوا الشعب المصري بشكل حقيقي.
لا
للتعديلات الدستورية.
Okay. So the second big mistake that the youth made at this point was that to not to go along with the constitutional referendum of March 2011 that was sort of put in place by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, because this resulted in kind of the loss of the revolutionary unity, and it really began the division of the country into secular and Islamist. And the youth were, the general vote was against the adjustments to the Constitution, but he says that they should have tried to kind of steer the roadmap in a different direction instead of letting the SCAF direct the issues. And this sort of lost unity and led to division.
في هذه المرحلة تم الاستفتاء، بعدها جاءت انتخابات مجلس الشعب. الشباب حاولوا النزول والمشاركة في هذه الانتخابات، ولكن غالبية الشباب لم يوفقوا في هذه الانتخابات بسبب عدم وجود دعم سواء مادي أو إعلامي جيد للشباب في هذه اللحظة.
So after the referendum, constitutional referendum of March, the next big stage was the parliamentary elections for the lower house of the parliament. And a lot of the youth who would participate in the revolution actually took part in the elections. They ran for parliament themselves, but they generally didn't do very well because of a lack of financial resources, of funding, and also because they didn't have a lot of media support or experience with these things.
في وقت الانتخابات الرئاسية كان حصل حدث مهم جدا، هو أحداث محمد محمود، ونعتبرها الموجة الثانية للثورة المصرية، عندما اعتدت قوات الجيش على وجبات الشرطة على المتظاهرين في ميدان التحرير. تم الدعوة لمظاهرات قوية لإقالة الحكومة وإعادة هيكلة وزارة الداخلية إعادة هيكلة وزارة الداخلية، ويتم تفويض الحكومة لأحد الرموز الثورية في المعارضة المصرية.
اوكي. يعني تفويض الجيش،
توكيل أحد يعني محمد بردعي أو الفتوح أو حمدين صباحي لأن يكون رئيسا الحكومة بدلا من وزير رئيس الوزراء في هذه اللحظة، وتفويض صلاحيات كاملة من المجلس العسكري لهذا رئيس الحكومة.
Okay. So then is that me? Okay. Around the time of the presidential elections, there was the big incident was the protests of Muhammad Mahmoud Street right near Tahrir, and the attack of the army and security force primarily on the protesters, many of whom were these young youth who had participated in the revolution in 2011. And there was many deaths, and this precipitated calls for the government to resign. And then what happened was sort of all the authority and the momentum in the revolution shifted away from the youth completely, and instead it was sort of deposited by the ruling armed forces High Council with these people who had stepped forward as candidates for the presidential election, like Mohammed Baradei and Abdel Fattah, and sort of Sabahi and the youth sort of were marginalized.
لكن للأسف لم نستطع النجاح في هذا المطلب. المجلس العسكري تحايل على هذا المطلب ودفعا إلى الانتخابات البرلمانية كي يفتت الزخم من الشارع الثوري. ثم انتقلنا إلى مرحلة أخرى هي مرحلة انتخابات الرئاسة. في هذا الوقت تفتت شباب الثورة بين المرشحين، بين الدكتور عبد المنعم فتوح بعد انسحاب الدكتور برادعي وحمدين صباحي في هذا الوقت.
So, I mean, there's a process happening where the army kind of takes the sort of revolutionary momentum and authority and it deposits or directs it into the parliamentary elections and the parliament, sort of marginalizing the youth. And then, of course, this happens completely with the presidential elections. So what happens is the youth are no longer the engine behind the revolution. Now it's in these different political processes. And then when the presidential campaign started, the youth are completely divided between the different candidates, especially originally with Baradei, and then after his leaving the race, Abdel Minam Abdel Fattah and Hamdain Sabahi.
في هذه اللحظة المعسكر الثوري ومعسكر الشباب تحديدا انقسم ما بين أبو الفتوح وحمدين صباحي، وفقد الكثير من الزخم في الشارع وفي الأصوات. أبو الفتوح حصل على 4 مليون صوت و100 ألف تقريبا. حمدين صباحي حصل على 5 مليون و200 ألف صوت. يعني إذا استطعنا إجماعهم فسيكون هذا الصوت الثوري الكامل في الشارع هو لما أعتقد 9 مليون صوت، ولكن تم تفتيته وخروج مرشحي المحسوبين على الثورة في هذه الانتخابات الرئاسية.
هذا في الدورة الأولى.
في الدورة الأولى، نعم.
The youth, the revolutionary youth, were especially divided mostly between Abdel Minam Abdel Fattah and Hamdain Sabahi. But if you look at in the first round of the election, so before the second round when there's runoff between Shafiq and Mohammed Morsi, Abdel Fattah got about 4 million something votes, and Hamdain Sabahi got about 5,200,000, if I'm hearing that correctly.
Yes.
And so that sort of not only is a totally divided revolutionary youth vote, but also you see the kind of totality of the voice of this youth is, becoming less and less significant.
حصل العادة بين شفيق ومحمد مرسي. غالبية شباب الثورة اختاروا ان هم اتعملت حملة اسمها عصير الليمون، مثل مصري بالعصر الليمون على المصريين ان هو يعمل شيء مكره عليه ومجبر انه يفعله. حملة عصير الليمون شباب دعموا الدكتور محمد مرسي في انتخابات الإعادة. قبل ظهور النتيجة كان هناك بعد الانتخابات وقبل ظهور النتيجة كان هناك محاولات لتزوير النتيجة لصالح أحمد شفيق. فقام الشباب بعمل اجتماع مع الدكتور محمد مرسي وجماعة الإخوان المسلمين في فندق فيرمونت. ضم هذا الاجتماع جميع غالبية شباب الثورة وغالبية الأطياف السياسية في مصر في هذه اللحظة والرموز السياسية في هذه اللحظة.
So during the second round of the presidential elections, when it was between Ahmed Shafiq, the former prime minister under Mubarak, and Mohammed Morsi, the youth undertook what was known as the make lemonade out of lemons campaign. So if you get lemons, you make lemonade. Morsi being the lemon, and so they supported Morsi. Then it looks like there were efforts to, I'm forgetting the word in English, fraudulently make Shafiq get more votes. I'm sure there's a word for that. I'm not remembering. Yeah, defraud something like skew the election results. And so a number of the youth met with President Morsi at the Fairmont Hotel. Is that the one near the airport?
Yes.
Yes. I stayed there once. They had very nice showers. Morsi, they met with him there, and this was actually a really interesting meeting because it brought together a lot of different sides from the Egyptian political scene, and they met with President Morsi or the person who would become President Morsi in an attempt to counter these fraudulent actions to help Shafiq.
كان هدف الاجتماع دوت ان يتم توحيد جبهة الثورة ضد الجبهة العسكرية النظام القديم، بحيث انتظر المعركة أنها ليست معركة جماعة الإخوان المسلمين مع الدولة العسكرية أو مع الفلول، ولكنها معركة ثورة ضد النظام القديم بأكمله. وتم الاتفاق على بعض البنود. كان الشباب أساسا هم الطرف الرئيسي في اختيار الأسماء في هذه اللحظة والاتصال بالجميع في هذا المؤتمر.
So this was a important moment of unification against the kind of ancien regime of the army and the Fulul elements, and the idea being that there may, yes, many of these youth might have problems with the Muslim Brotherhood, but they have a bigger and more immediate problem, which is overcoming the former regime elements. And it was during this meeting and in its wake, the youth were kind of the primary voice of communicating with society and presenting this front to the society.
ولكن للأسف الشديد جماعة الإخوان المسلمين والدكتور محمد مرسي لم يلتزموا بهذا الاتفاق الذي تم الاتفاق عليه في هذا المؤتمر، وأدى هذا إلى أزمات كثيرة بين الشباب والاتجاهات السياسية وبين جماعة الإخوان المسلمين في اللاحق. المحطة المهمة الثانية هي محطة الإعلان الدستوري اللي قام به محمد مرسي في شهر نوفمبر 2012.
Okay. Then the next major station was, point was the Constitutional Declaration of President Morsi made in November of 2012. This was representative of what the youth felt was happening after this kind of agreement when they met with the president in the Fairmont Hotel, that because the Muslim Brotherhood was not following up on its agreement. They were not holding their part in this alliance against the former regime, and the Constitutional Declaration was really the crystallization of this failure on the part of the Ikhwan to abide by the agreement.
حدثت الأحداث الاتحادية وحدث تقسيم الشارع المصري. الشارع الثوري حصل في انشقاق كامل، والجبهة المعارضة للنظام القديم حصل فيها انشقاق حقيقي في هذه اللحظة، لأن الشعب واجه، شعب التنظيم واجه التنظيم، الشباب في الشارع، وعليه أصبح هناك معسكرين: في المعسكر المعارض للنظام القديم وهو معسكر الإخوان المسلمين، ومعسكر شباب الثورة الذي انضم إليه للأسف الشديد في اللاحق الفلول والنظام القديم مرة ثانية.
يعني الفلول انضموا إلى الجزء. نعم. So then, of course, after that, you had kind of spiraling of events like the Ittihadiyya protests and violence, and this led to just really a total break inside the opposition camp. So the camp that is, alliance that is opposed to the ancien regime has a complete split, and one group facing the other group, one organization facing the other organization, one of them being the Muslim Brotherhood, the other one being the Revolutionary Youth, and then the former ancien regime elements basically join themselves along with the Revolutionary Youth camp against the Muslim Brotherhood.
دي كانت بداية سقوط حقيقي للثورة المصرية في اللحظة ديت، لأن حاول الشباب بشكل أو بآخر الحديث مع جماعة الإخوان المسلمين للتراجع عن بعض القرارات مع الدكتور محمد مرسي، لمحاولة تصحيح الأزمة في لجنة الدستور، في الحكومة القادمة خلاف، ولكن للأسف الشديد كان التعامل يقابل دائما بالرفض للمبادرات المختلفة التي تقدم من الشباب، بحيث ان احنا نكون مرة تانية الجبهة القديمة في مواجهة النظام الذي يحاول الرجوع بشكل ثوري أمام النظام المنتخب الحديث.
So this was really the moment of the kind of the loss of the Egyptian revolution as a moment of potential for real change. And since then, there's been an attempt to, on behalf of many of these youth and other groups, to try and reconstitute this original alliance that was going to oppose and try and kind of completely overturn the previous regime and lead to a new future.
ظهرت حركة تمرد في شهر مارس 2013. الحقيقة جميع رموز حركة تمرد هم شباب من الصف الثالث للثورة المصرية، من مجموعة من الحركات المختلفة اللي هو الذين يقودون حركة تمرد بشكل رئيسي الواجهة ليها. يجب أن نذكر هذا. شباب طلعوا هذا البيان وجمعوا توقعات، طبعا تلقفتها أجهزة الدولة العميقة المختلفة وتلقفها النظام القديم وتعامل معها كأنها الخلاص له من نظام الإخوان المسلمين والنظام الحالي.
So then امتى حصل
شهر آخر 3/2013.
Okay.
مارش.
Yeah, in March of 2013, there's the beginnings and emergence of the Tamarrud, or I don't know, rebellion or mutiny movement. And this was represented a kind of alliance of lots of different small groups and youth groups especially to stand up against the current government or the government at the time. And Mr. Abbas mentions that, yes, it did turn out that Tamarrud was being infiltrated by security agency people and was being assisted by the security services, but we also have to give them credit because they're the ones who sort of came out with the original declaration, provided the aegis under which these groups could gather.
كانت دعوة التمرد الرئيسية هي انتخابات رئاسية مبكرة في بعد 30/6، وتم الدعوة ليوم 30/6 لانتخابات رئاسية مبكرة، وده كان الدعوة الرئيسية. مضى الجميع على هذا مسار ديمقراطي محترم نحترمه جميعا. عندنا خلافات مع هذه الدولة، فنطالب الرئيس المنتخب بانتخابات نزيهة أن يقوم بعمل انتخابات رئاسية مبكرة نظرا لفشله في إدارة الدولة من رأي الشباب.
So the main demand of the Tamarrud was that the presidential elections be brought forth early and that they would happen on June 30th. This was considered to be a reasonable, the youth considered to be a reasonable demand. It's a democratic demand, and you're asking a democratically elected president to, looking at the level of division in the society to bring forth elections and have another democratic fair election to see the direction of the country.
30 يونيو نزل الناس للشوارع وشارك كثير من الشباب في هذه اللحظة. أنا لم أشارك في 30 يونيو، كنت أرى أن العسكر قادم في هذه اللحظة، ولكن الشباب غالبية الشباب الذين شاركوا من أجل انتخابات رئاسية مبكرة. جاء 3 يوليو وقام المجلس العسكري الفريق عبد الفتاح السيسي بعمل انقلاب عسكري. أنا لا أقول انقلابا عسكريا على محمد مرسي أو جماعة الإخوان المسلمين أو هذه الشرعية، أنا أقول أنه انقلابا عسكريا على ثورة يناير 25 يناير بشكل حقيقي، وانقلابا عسكريا على كل مطالب ثورة 25 يناير. المجلس العسكري منذ اللحظة الأولى كان يريد عودة الدولة له وملكه مرة أخرى. اعتبر أن ثورة 25 يناير نكسة بالنسبة له، هذا الإعلام الرسمي يتحدث بهذا الشكل، نكسة بالنسبة له. عادة الدولة ليه مرة تانية في 3 يوليو بهذا الشكل الواضح والصريح. نحن نريد دولتنا لتعود مرة أخرى. قالوا أنه ليس انقلابا عسكريا ولن يحكم عسكريا ولا خلافه. منذ 3 أيام منذ يومين فقط قال المجلس العسكري رشح فتح السيسي رئيسا للجمهورية، كأن الجيش المصري حزبا سياسيا ينافس في الانتخابات، يقرر ترشيح فلان أو عدم ترشيح فلان.
So of course then June 30th happens with the protests. He did not participate in the protests. He believed that the security services, the army, would be the beneficiary ultimately, so he did not participate. But what happened, and there was the military coup led by General Abdel Fattah Sisi, and he calls this a military coup, and it's not just a military coup against the elected presidents; it's a military coup against the January Revolution in a real and complete way, sort of really overturning it totally, and that. What the army and kind of the Mubarak era regime they saw this really as getting their property back. That and if you watch the media in the days after the coup, there was really actually obvious and explicit statements that we've gotten Egypt back. Egypt is ours again. It's returned to its proper owners, literally like property, and that this was very clear in the media. And just 2 days ago, or 2 or 3 days ago. The Army, the High Council of the Armed Forces announced that General Abdel Fattah Sisi would run as a presidential candidate, there's been a lot of debate about whether or not someone who is in the military can be president and should be a civilian, or this completely just disappeared. It said the army said Abdel Fattah Sisi is going to be a presidential candidate, as if it's a political party who's sort of agreeing on putting a candidate forth in the presidential election.
بعد 3 يوليو قال عبد الفتاح السيسي أنه يلبي نداء الشباب في التظاهر ومطالبة بإطاحة محمد مرسي، ولكن وجدنا أن خرج قانون اسمه قانون التظاهر لمنع الشباب من التظاهر ومن الاحتجاج على الممارسات التي تقوم بها الدولة. وجدنا هجوم على الجامعات، جميع الجامعات المصرية تم انتهاكها والهجوم عليها من قبل قوات الجيش وقوات الشرطة المصرية، وقتل طلبة يتظاهرون داخل هذه الجامعات. ما زالت جامعة القاهرة وجامعة الأزهر تحت الحصار داخل الكليات، داخل إطار الجامعة، قوات الجيش وقوات الشرطة داخل الجامعات. رموز الثورة المصرية جميعها: أحمد ماهر، محمد عادل، علاء الفتاح، مصطفى النجار، عمرو حمزاوي، عبد الرحمن يوسف، هؤلاء جميعا الآن يا إما في السجون إما في محاكمات وسيدخلون السجن أكيد. يعني ده اللي موجود عندنا. وائل غنيم مهدد ب طلعت تسريبات لمكالمات خاصة تم رصدها من المخابرات الحربية في وقت اقتحام مقرات أمن الدولة في مصر وقت الثورة المصرية لوائل غنيم، وهناك حملة ممنهجة للقضاء والتنكيل بوائل غنيم، ومن المتوقع أن يكون هناك محاكمات لوائل غنيم في الفترة القادمة أيضا.
لما عمل في ثورة يناير أو
ثورة يناير، ما هو انتقام من ثورة يناير وانطلاق على ثورة يناير.
So of course despite the fact that the youth who protested against Morsi on June 30th had this was an attempt to protest to call this president to step down. What they got in the end after the coup was in fact things like a law that banned all protests, the protest law that was mentioned earlier. Mohammed Fadel mentioned that anybody who goes out and protests against a state can, this is breaking the law. And there's been very bloody attacks on universities. Almost all the universities in Egypt have had protests by students and have been really attacked by army and security forces, leading to killing of students. And Azhar University and Cairo University are really continue to be under a state of basically encirclement and siege by the security services. And all the symbols of the January Revolution, all the people like Ahmed Maher, Ala Abdel Fattah, Mustafa Nagar, Amr Hamzawi, these people are all either in prison or they're under indictment. And in fact, he mentioned even Wa'il Ghunaim, who was originally one of the early symbols of the revolution, who is in the Kulana Khalid Saeed, the website. In fact, there's now a campaign in the potential in the judiciary to hold these actions that he did in the January Revolution against him and to actually institute criminal proceedings against them.
الوضع الحالي مجملا وموجزا آخر نقطة. قانون التظاهر يقول من يشارك في مظاهرة ضد الانقلاب ما بين 3 سنين ل5 سنين، ده قرار من مساعد وزير الداخلية، ومن يقود مظاهرة إعدام. ده يعني ده قرار اللي طالع من وزارة الداخلية. السؤال اللي بيطرح نفسه: طب ليه الشاب يتظاهر سلميا؟ ما كده ميت، يقود مظاهرة، ما يروح يفجر نفسه. نصنع الإرهاب بنفسينا، في الدولة تصنع الإرهاب بهذا الشكل. هيقود مظاهرة هيتعدم، طب ما يروح يفجر نفسه، ما كده يبقى كده استفاد، حتى ان هو من وجهة نظره ان هو موت حد. في دي نقطة. النقطة الثانية ودي النقطة المهمة، في إحباط حقيقي من غالبية الشباب لمواقف الدول الغربية عموما اتجاه الانقلاب. بعد ثورة 25 يناير كان الشباب ينظرون إلى الدول التي وقفت بجانب حق الشعب في الحرية والديمقراطية بعد سنين طويلة من دعم الدكتاتوريات في الوطن العربي بسبب مصالح هذه الدول الخاصة في هذه الدول. تناسى الشباب هذا الدعم الغربي الكامل للدكتاتوريات، ولكن في هذه اللحظة يرجع مرة تانية الدعم الغربي للديكتاتوريات والفاشية العسكرية في مصر عن طريق الدعم المباشر أو السكوت عن المجازر وانتهاكات الحريات وانتهاكات حقوق الإنسان اللي بتحصل في مصر في اللحظة دي.
Any أحباط يعني
Expressed.
So there's two important points he wants to finish with. You have to look at what's happened. So now this protest law means that you can get between 3 and 5 years in prison for participating in a protest. And we have to remember that here a protest is anything over 10 people, basically, that get together without Ministry of Justice permission. And if you lead the protest, that's death penalty. Okay. How is this? How have things gotten to this point? He's not talking about people, youth who want to go and blow themselves up and do a suicide bombing or kill people. This is just a peaceful protest. How is it if you're doing a peaceful protest that you can be in prison for 3 to 5 years or put to death? And this is these are things that came out directly from the Deputy Minister of Justice and the Justice Ministry. And then the second thing is there's a sense that there's a real conspiracy on the part of foreign nations, Western countries, especially regarding Egypt, because these are the countries that are constantly talking about democracy and the importance of democracy and human rights and these things. And yet, of course, everybody knows about the decades of support that Mubarak regime enjoyed from countries like the United States and other countries in the region have enjoyed, whether it's direct financial support or political support for dictators. But also now we see again a return to this support, either direct support in the form of political aid, financial aid, but also the support of remaining silent in the face of what's happening in Egypt. And that's sort of equally stunning to the youth. Okay? Thank you very much. And if there's any mistakes, then I'll try and clarify them. Miriam, do you want to proceed?
Yeah, so can you translate my talk into Arabic?
No, I can do pig Latin. I'm not sure.
Well, that's very undemocratic of you. So I'm going to be speaking about the role of civic entrepreneurship in Egypt with a particular focus on the coup. And I'll start out by talking about the concept itself and in particular what it means with respect to revolutions. I'll go on to talk about civic entrepreneurship after January 25th and then how the coup sort of changed things and then end with lessons learned. So one of the most common debates that we hear about the Egyptian revolution, particularly in the West, is whether or not what happened in Egypt was in fact a revolution. And if it was a revolution, was it a success? Now, what often determines the outcomes of conversations like that is how people understand what the word revolution means. The most common way of defining revolution is a massive change that where one political system is completely replaced by a completely different political system. It is a transformation that is often from bad to good. So societies improve as a result of these revolutions. They are linear processes, very black and white. Now, obviously, this is not what's happened in Egypt or, frankly, in any of the countries that have been at the forefront of events in the Arab world over the last 3 years. So was the Egyptian uprising a revolution, and was it a success? Well, I would definitely say that it was a revolution, and that its outcome is still uncertain. And the reason I say that is because the sort of transformations that are required in order for revolutionary change to really take hold, it's true that political changes on the national or meta level are important, but at the same time, what's also very important is that you see transformations at the grassroots level among local communities. And that, to me, is what has been happening inside Egypt that started on January 25th. Now, the way those transformations have been happening is through something that I call civic entrepreneurship. Civic entrepreneurship is any citizen-led effort that mobilizes communities to take advantage of opportunities and crises to help further the common good. It includes protest movements. It includes that are very political protest movements that have a more social purpose, women's groups, youth groups, volunteer organizations. It includes artistic musical and theatrical collectives. It even includes civically minded tech startups. These efforts are oftentimes very creative, very innovative, and very surprising. David Graeber, who is an anthropologist and an activist himself, talks about revolutionary moments as followed by an outpouring of social, intellectual, and artistic creativity. Everyone feels not only the right, but usually the immediate practical need to recreate and reimagine everything around them. And that's essentially what civic entrepreneurship is. Another really important part of what this concept does is that it helps both create and nurture the public sphere. The public sphere is the place where individuals come to speak and act together. In Hannah Arendt's words, and she's a political theorist who worked in the mid-century of the 20th century, it is where politics happens. It's where people and the state interact. And it's where the people get their power. And as was mentioned earlier today, process is a very important part of democracy, but popular power, people power, is also a critical component. And that's what the public sphere helps perpetuate, and that is something that civic entrepreneurship feeds into. So, January 25th. January 25th is probably one of the most incredible historical examples we have about the power of the public sphere. From January 25th until Mubarak's ouster on February 11th, the Egyptian people headed onto the streets, gathered together in the most public of places, the squares, the streets, and they spoke and they acted in concert behind one goal, the ousting of a dictator who had ruled their country for decades. They also expressed a desire for a better life. It was a very personal and also very community-oriented experience that at its base was about human dignity. In a country where, before January 25th, the public sphere was very circumscribed, where you had activism, but that activism was very much happening on the social fringes, after January 25th, the Egyptian people made their public debut. Strangers met, people who didn't know each other, but who were now united behind this common goal. And the experience of collaborating together, and Tahrir Square is the most iconic example, really laid the groundwork for the burgeoning of a public sphere that would continue after Mubarak's fall. In the book I wrote, I interviewed quite a few Egyptians who were involved in this mobilization, and they spoke about the experience of meeting these people and of coming together and how that changed them and inspired them to then found the many organizations, movements, groups that then took over the public sphere after Mubarak was ousted. So I can talk about the different organizations. There are so many of them. Just to give a few examples of the kinds of groups that came out of this experience of Tahrir and of January 25th, you have groups like Moserin, the video collective that has been extremely effective in creating videos about security and military and government-led repression on the streets. You have the No to Military Trials campaign, which has mobilized to oppose military trials for civilians. You have Operation Anti-Sexual Harassment and Tahrir Bodyguard, which have both been very active in opposing sexual harassment on Egypt's streets, and on and on and on. But the most powerful and important, particularly from our perspective, example of civic entrepreneurship was the ousting of Morsi. Tamarrud, as has been spoken about at length already today, was frankly a grassroots movement. We can talk about the infiltration, we can talk about whether or not what happened on July 3rd was pre-planned, but the fact of the matter is this movement was able to mobilize and connect with the Egyptian people, was able to actually get them to move in accordance with a unified message or goal onto the streets and to act in furtherance of that goal. And that, in essence, is what the grassroots is, and it's what civic entrepreneurship is. Now, of course, what happened on July 3rd, what's happened since then, has not been very positive. And again, many have already spoken about the very negative developments since then. the arresting of Brotherhood leaders, the jailing and killing of Brotherhood supporters, the crackdown against journalists, the countless number of journalists that are now in jail, so much so that Egypt was one of the top or the worst jailers of journalists in 2013. The arrest of very notable revolutionaries, the passage of a protest law, the return of emergency law for about 3 months before the protest law was instituted. Things are really bad. At the same time, some of the groups that I mentioned before, many of them are still very active. The No to Military Trials campaign still holds protests. Mossadegh still creates its videos. Tahrir Bodyguard, Operation Anti-Sexual Harassment, they're still active as well. But the price they pay for this activism is now incredibly high. So ironically, civic entrepreneurship, this phenomenon, this thing that should be and usually is very much an important part of bringing about participatory democracy, ended up creating one of the most, or leading to one of the most authoritarian moments in Egypt's history. So why did things turn out so differently this time around? Why was June 30th, the outcome of June 30th, so different than January 25th? There are three sort of factors in my mind. The role of the elites, the new actors, the new members of Egyptian society that headed onto the street, and finally the position taken by the revolutionaries. So in terms of the elites, they have gotten a lot smarter and a lot more effective in what they do. When, after Morsi was ousted, they moved very quickly to essentially try to get the greatest number of Egyptians on their side and try to conquer the public sphere by dividing it. They did this primarily through three narratives that were propagated both through the state itself and through media. And those are terrorism, the narrative of terrorism, the narrative of xenophobia, and finally ultranationalism. So as we all know, from essentially the moment that Morsi was ousted, the entire Brotherhood was essentially declared to be a terrorist organization, and its members were terrorists. This was a narrative that was extremely effective at excluding the Brotherhood from the public sphere, from Egyptian life, and excluding its members as well. Connected to this was the narrative that the Brotherhood was not, in fact, interested in helping Egypt, was not, in fact, Egyptian, but was this non-Egyptian entity that was trying to destabilize the country, that it was working with entities outside of Egypt, Syrians, Palestinians, to weaken the country. And this, of course, gave rise to a narrative of xenophobia, one in which both Egyptians, those who were supportive of the Brotherhood, and non-Egyptians were swept up, and once again, excluded from the public sphere. And then lastly, you have ultranationalism. And this ultranationalism wasn't just about being Egyptian, it was about allegiance to the state. So anybody who was critical of the state was not a real Egyptian. So through these narratives, the government was able to create majority support for itself, while at the same time dividing the public sphere and thereby weakening the public sphere. But the Egyptian people weren't passive victims of this process. Khalid Fahmy talks about the new actors that came onto the street on June 30th, the couch revolutionaries is what he labels them. These were people who had by and large sat on the sidelines during January 25th, and who hadn't participated in the mobilization to oust Mubarak, who had in some cases very much admired what the youth had achieved, but over the intervening 2.5 years at that point had really come to resent the revolution, blaming it for the political and economic instability in the country. And for them, the revolution was the enemy, and those that were identified with the revolution were the enemy. And so what we see now is in my mind, the most terrifying part of this entire process, where the line between citizen and state repression has been blurred. You have citizens that have taken on the job of deciding who is and who is not a true Egyptian. You have regular Egyptians that are excluding other members, other Egyptians, from Egyptian society and the public sphere, whether it's through more sort of mundane daily acts of silencing criticism to actual vigilante justice. Finally, we have the revolutionaries. So as Mohammed spoke about the country's well-known and well-established revolutionary groups at that point were very much in support of Tamarrud in the lead up to June 30th. Many participated in the protests, and many cheered the ousting of Morsi. Now, they had arguably good motives in deciding to align themselves with Tamarrud, but at the same time, by giving their support to this movement before January 30th, they helped credentialize it. They gave it legitimacy in the eyes of many. As some have pointed out, it was people like Ahmed Maher coming out in support of Tamarrud that really helped give it a boost. Now, hindsight is 20/20, and I'm not here to judge the revolutionaries and the decisions they made at that point, but we need to acknowledge that they did play a very critical role. After July 3rd happened, many of them saw that the direction the country was heading in was disturbing and troubling, and some spoke out. Ahmed Maher was one of the people who did speak out. But at the same time, at that point, many also decided not to speak out, and the window of opportunity closed very quickly. So, a couple of lessons learned. I think what July 3rd, June 30th, July 3rd has shown us is that the public sphere really does have a lot of political power, that the possibilities of generating the political power for people within that arena is extremely potent. But at the same time, for it to remain powerful, it must be inclusive and tolerant. The public sphere in Egypt right now is not in a good place, and it's not in a good place because of the divisions that have been created, which I spoke about before. Maintaining the public sphere also requires ensuring that that kind of division doesn't take root, also requires ensuring that that power is generally diffused throughout society. So where power concentrates in government, in particular, it's very dangerous for the public sphere. What was important about the Morsi government was that while Morsi was in power, power itself was diffuse. You had the government, you had the establishment, you had the public sphere. You didn't have one place where it was all concentrated. What happened during June 30th, July 3rd was that power became concentrated. The people, the public sphere, aligned with the government or the establishment at that time. And at this point, it has essentially ceded its power to the ruling establishment. Finally, an important part of ensuring that power does not concentrate in one place is that disobedience must become the driving force within the public sphere. A social psychologist named Erich Fromm had really interesting things to say about what that disobedience looks like. And he said, in his book on disobedience, that a person can become free through acts of disobedience by learning to say no to power. But not only is the capacity for disobedience the condition of freedom, freedom is also the condition of disobedience. If I'm afraid of freedom, I cannot dare to say no. I cannot have the courage to be disobedient. Indeed, freedom and the capacity for disobedience are inseparable. So, what's going to happen next? Like, where is Egypt going? If any of you know the answer to that question, then we should totally hang out, because I don't know what it is. But I will say this, that as long as a large portion of the Egyptian population continues to support the government with blind obedience, where there is no disobedience, that the public sphere will suffer. And that if the public sphere suffers, the chances of Egypt returning to the path of democracy are very slim. And I'd like to end with a quote from a piece of graffiti that was recently seen inside Cairo. And bear with me, my Arabic, but this is what it said. Yaskut kul min khan asker fulul ikhwan. Down with all those who betrayed us, the military, the old guard, and the Muslim brothers. Thank you.
Okay. السلام عليكم. أنا هحاول أكون موجز ومختصر علشان الوقت وعلشان جوناثان والترجمة. الحقيقة أنا هتكلم على محورين بشكل سريع. هنتكلم على موضوع ال NGOs، والنقطة الثانية هتكلم حوالين الحركات والتنظيمات الشبابية. وأنا لا أفضل الحديث عن الوضع بعد 30/6 لأني أرى أن 30/6 رغم أن أنا ما شاركتش فيها وأعلنت عدم مشاركتي، إلا أن كان من حق الناس أنها تعترض على الأداء المتردي لحكومة الدكتور مرسي، والتظاهر حق أصيل للناس للتعبير عن آرائهم. فما كانش عندي مشكلة في 30/6. أنا كان عندي مشكلة في التحالفات اللي تمت في سياق 30/6، وإن احنا ننزل نتظاهر نطالب بإجراء وإحنا مش عارفين what's next.
Peace be upon you. He's going to be short. I'll be short and sweet for the sake of Jonathan and you all. He's going to talk about two main points. The first one is the NGOs, and the second one is the organized youth movements. He did not participate in the June 30th protests. He publicly stated he was not participating, but he sees that it's a core and fundamental right of people to do so. So he supported the right of the people to protest, because one of the core rights that people have is the right to self-expression. One of the reasons he did not participate is because he didn't think it was appropriate to go and call for this process to start and to have the president leave, but not actually knowing what was going to happen next without a clear idea.
أنا هبدأ بموضوع الجمعيات الأهلية. الحقيقة احنا عندنا هنتكلم على شق جمعيات حقوق الإنسان فيما بعد 3/7 بعد الانقلاب، وهنتكلم على الجمعيات الخيرية. أولا فيما يخص جمعيات حقوق الإنسان، الحقيقة الانقلاب كان مفيد جدا إن احنا نكتشف إن فعليا مفيش حركة لحقوق الإنسان في مصر، وإن مفيش نضال من أجل حقوق الإنسان، ولكن احنا كنا بنتعامل مع مجموعة من الوكلاء التجاريين بيرفعوا لافتة حقوق الإنسان.
Speaking about two types of civil organizations, civil society organizations after the coup of July 3rd, the ones inside Egypt, the ones outside Egypt. The coup was very revealing, because what it showed is that inside Egypt there aren't actually any civil society organizations that are really committed to human rights. Rather, he found basically they're merchants, they're people who trade in human rights but really don't care about them.
عدد من جمعيات حقوق الإنسان اجتمع بوزارة الداخلية، وكانوا بيطالبوهم باستخدام القوة المسلحة لفض اعتصام رابعة. وبعد الفض الدموي 2 من أبرز الرموز اللي كانت بتتصدى لقضايا حقوق الإنسان في مصر، وهم الدكتور سعد الدين إبراهيم والأستاذ حافظ أبو سعدة، وأنا تلمست على أيدين حافظ بالمناسبة في مجال حقوق الإنسان، وقفوا في بهو وزارة الداخلية بما لذلك من دلالة، وقالوا أن الفض وعملية القتل تمت وفقا للمعايير الدولية للفض، وكأن هناك معايير دولية للقتل.
Hafiz Abu Saad.
Abu Saad, yeah.
Abu Saad, okay. So, in fact, two of the sort of leading symbols of human rights organizations and activism in Egypt, and a number of these organizations met with the Interior Minister with the Interior Ministry before the breakup of the sit-ins at Rabaa and elsewhere, and they actually asked, please use weapons to go in and break up these sit-ins. And after the bloodbath at Rabaa and elsewhere, two of the symbols of human rights activism in Egypt, Saad Ibrahim and Hafiz Abu Saada, actually
make a press conference and
they did a press conference at the lobby of the Ministry of Interior and said that this all took place according to human rights standards and things like that. International human rights standards, yes, thank you.
بعد فض رابعة فعليا في 4 كيانات فقط في مصر بدأت تتكلم حوالين المذبحة وحوالين إحراق الجثث وحوالين المفقودين وحوالين منع المصابين من تلقي العلاج، وفي حالة تضييق شديد عليهم، والباقي التزم الصمت التام. فده الجناح الخاص بحقوق الإنسان فيما يخص الجمعيات الأهلية أو غير الحكومية في مصر.
So after the coup, after the the real repression started with the breakup of the Rabaa sit-ins, there's only 4 organizations in 4 entities in Egypt that spoke up at all about human rights, about the deaths, the killings, the burning of bodies, and the disappearance of people. All the rest have remained completely silent on this.
ننتقل للجمعيات بقى اللي هي الجمعيات التشاريتي أو الجمعيات الخيرية. الحقيقة الانقلاب ما كانش عنده الصبر إن هو يتركها تعمل وتحت إطار الحرب اللي هم بيعملوها على الإرهاب وتقطيع أوصال الإخوان. حصل نوع من أنواع الجنون، فأصدر قرار بإغلاق 1055 جمعية خيرية بتعمل في مصر، من ضمنهم 4 من أكبر الجمعيات في مصر اللي من نتائج شغلهم إن هم بيكفلوا ما يقرب من 500,000 أسرة مصرية. كل أسرة مينيمم فيها 4 أو 5 أفراد.
So in terms of the charity organizations, there was that post-coup and post the repression in August, there was the government did not have any patience to let these charitable organizations continue to do their work under the kind of the framework of the war on terror that was being prosecuted. The second is that there was, of course, this sort of anti-Ikhwan fever, craziness, and so anything that was even remotely Islamist was tarred with the Ikhwan brush. And what this led the government to do is to shut down around 1,055 charitable organizations. Some of the biggest ones were serving over 500,000 families.
الفلوس اللي تم مصادرتها من الجمعيات دي بلغت 10 مليار جنيه مصري. أحب أقول لكم إن 80% من المدارس في مصر بتملكها جمعيات خيرية. ما عنديش نسبة بالمستشفيات، بس أقدر أقول لكم إن أكبر مستشفى في الشرق الأوسط في حضانات أطفال بتملكها الجمعية الشرعية تم مصادرتها.
So the money that was seized by the government from these charitable organizations amounts to some 10 billion Egyptian pounds, which is, I don't know what, like $2.5 billion. $1.5 billion. Maybe the rate went up or down or something. I mean, the 80% around of the schools in Egypt are owned by charitable organizations. These charitable organizations. The largest, including also the largest hospital in the Middle East, is owned by one of the most famous charitable and one of the oldest, actually, Islamic organizations in Egypt. The Jam'iyya Shari'ah was also shut down.
1924.
Jam'iyya Shari'ah was founded in 1924. And it's not political.
Non-political, and they are Salafi, and they are supporting the coup.
They're supporting the coup and they're Salafi. That was
الحقيقة جزء يعني أحد أسباب مصادرة أموال الجمعيات هو الأزمة المالية اللي موجودة في مصر، وده النسق تقريبا اللي بتمشي عليه معظم الديكتاتوريات العسكرية وهي بتنشأ، وأبشركم إن الخطوة الجاية هتبقى تأميم ومصادرة أموال.
يعني هم مصادرة الأموال التأمين.
يعني هو خد أموال الجمعيات الخيرية كويس، لأن جزء من الموضوع إنه عنده أزمة مالية. الخطوة الثانية هيبدأ يفكر في مصادرة أموال خاصة، شركات تأمين.
بالفعل عملها مع الإخوان، مع فتاة الإخوان.
So one of the reasons that these monies were seized is because the state's facing a huge financial crisis, and that probably it's likely that the next step would be moving from seizing these public organizations money or these organizations money to seizing the money of private companies like insurance companies and things like that.
يعني يمكن تكون أحد فوائد الانقلاب أيضا إن هو كشف لنا بشكل ما إن مفيش مجتمع مدني حقيقي في مصر قادر إن هو يشتغل بشكل موازي للدولة وبعيدا عن هيمنتها، وإن ما زالت كل الأمور بتتم تحت سيطرة كاملة من الدولة، سواء فيما يخص جمعيات الشأن العام زي جمعيات الديمقراطية وحقوق الإنسان أو الجمعيات الخيرية أو الجمعيات الدينية.
So So one of the kind of the things the things we've learned from this revolution is that there's no real.
From the coup.
From the coup. Thank you. Is that there's no real civil society in Egypt that can basically function parallel to the government and take on the same work as the government. Everything has to be done by the government, whether it's things like human rights or whether it's organizations that deal with things like religious services.
طيب انتقل للقسم الثاني اللي هو الخاص بالشباب والحركات الشبابيه او التنظيمات الشبابيه بعد 3/7 مش 30 يونيو.
He's going to move now to the youth organizations, the youth movements after the June 30th protests.
بشكل عام after July 3rd.
After July 3rd. Yeah.
بشكل عام مشاكل التنظيمات الشبابيه في مصر بعد 3 يوليو هي بالضبط نفس المشاكل قبل 3 يوليو. مفيش اي اختلاف.
The problems that have been faced by the youth movements, youth organizations in Egypt after the coup of July 3rd are the same exact ones that were faced beforehand, internally and things like that.
الفرق الوحيد هو في نسبة الدم المهدر في شوارع مصر من الشباب. الشباب بيبذل دمه من أجل إقامة بلد ديمقراطي وإقامة تحول ديمقراطي وبناء دولة مدنية منذ يوم 25 يناير 2011 وحتى هذه اللحظة. بعد 3/7 بقت نسبة الدم المسفوك في مصر أعلى ولكن كان أمر مستمر.
The only thing that's changed is the amount of blood that's been shed in the streets of Egypt for the sake of trying to achieve a democratic society. This was the intention of the January 25th revolution, and this is the continuing mission. And the only thing that's changed is the amount of blood that's been spilled is more and more. The same problems are still there.
هنحاول نستعرض بشكل سريع أهم المشاكل دي. أهم مشكلة موجودة من وجهة نظري أو الأولى اللي أبدأ بيها هي الفجوة الجيلية ما بين الشباب وما بين الأجيال الأقدم منهم وده متعلق بنظرتهم للأمور. يعني الحياة السياسية في مصر بيسيطر عليها جيل كان موجود أثناء فترة مبارك اتعلم سياسة أو تم تدريبه على العمل السياسي بشكل معين وفق قواعد معينة ليهم سقف محدود في الطموحات. كل علاقتهم بفكرة التغيير هي تغيير الأفراد دون تغيير سياسات أو خطط أو رؤى أو محاولة التفكير بشكل مختلف. في مقابل جيل شاب بيسعى لتغيير حقيقي هو شايف إنه هو مفيش أي سقف لأحلامه أو طموحاته غير السماء. ما عندوش أي مشكلة إنه هو يجرب ويفشل ويقوم من أول وجديد وشايف إن التغيير بالأساس تغيير أفكار وسياسات مش تغيير أفراد.
So he's now going to discuss the main problems that these youth movements have and have faced. The single biggest one he thinks is the generation gap between these youth and the older generations that were in charge. And this really affects and stems from their view of how to deal with political issues. There's the generation that came up, the older generation that came to maturity in the Mubarak era, for whom there was a very clear ceiling about what could be changed and what could be accomplished. And basically, you could change individuals. You could get rid of this person, you get rid of that person. You couldn't really change frameworks. You couldn't have a different vision. You couldn't have real substantive change. This is as opposed to the youth, the new generation that doesn't see any ceiling for the potential for change and that thinks that really real change is not individuals being removed from a position or something like that, but actually changing structures and frameworks.
المشكلة الثانية هي طبعا هي ضعف الخبرة بما ان احنا بنتكلم حوالين ان مفيش نماذج يقتدى بيها كويس فيما يخص التغيير والنضال من اجل الديمقراطية فبالتالي الخبرة ضعيفة مفيش موديول يقوموا بالقياس عليه.
The second major problem is a lack of experience amongst the youth on how to do things like set up democratic processes and things like that. And this comes from the fact that they didn't ever have a chance to try this or do this and have any experience.
المشكلة الثانية الثالثة فيما يخص التنظيمات وقدرتها على الاستثمار هي قلة التمويل وضعفه. المشكلة الرابعة الرومانسية أو المثالية الزائدة و يعني الوثوق الزائد في بعض الكيانات. والمشكلة الخامسة التهميش والتهميش أنا هركز عليه بس
الرابع
المثالية الرومانسية والمثالية. نعم.
Okay. Sorry, I thought that was the third major problem these youth organizations and movements face is a lack of funding, and the fourth one is kind of this romantic and I use that in the kind of idealized sense, not the romantic movie sense, but the kind of myth or the legend of Rabaa and everything about it. And then the fifth one.
اوكي خامس حاجة هي التهميش. ولما اتكلم على تهميش الشباب خصوصا بعد الحراك الثوري اللي اوجدوه في الشارع في مصر، بيبقى احنا عندنا مشكله حقيقيه ان في ناس حاسه طول الوقت ان هي بتقوم بمجهود وانها بتبذل كويس بدون ما يبقى في صدى وبدون ما يحصل لها تمكين حقيقي. وهضرب مثالين على موضوع التهميش. هتكلم على مثل التهميش الحكومي والتهميش الغير حكومي. بالنسبه للتهميش الحكومي هنتكلم حوالين اقصاء الشباب وابعادهم عن اداره الشان العام سياسيا وتنفيذيا من وقت قيام الثوره كويس حتى اللحظه دي. الشباب الثوره ثوره 25 يناير ما كانش ليهم دور حقيقي جوه جوه حكومه عصام شرف الاولى او الثانيه، ولا حكومه الجنزوري طبعا لان هم كانوا معترضين عليها، ولا اي حكومه من الحكومات. الشباب اللي اشترك في 30 يونيو بمزاجهم او غصب عنهم او هم فاهمين ان دي كاونتر ريفولوشن او لا كويس، برضو مش موجودين في المشهد، مش موجودين في الحكومه، تم استغلالهم ووضعهم تنحيتهم جانبا ايضا.
So the fifth major problem is the marginalization of the youth, and they were never really allowed to have any major influence over any of the governments that have come and gone since the January 25th revolution. He's going to talk about first government marginalization. These youth were never given a role in the government, either in formation of policy or implementation of policy, since January 25th until now. And what that means is that even the ones who do have experience, who are aware of, let's say, the notion of counter-revolution, they're simply not present in any meaningful way in the government. They could never have any role. Mahmoud Bongo.
وصلت له ازاي ده؟ لا بس هي مش اكزيكتيف. لا
even Mahmoud Bongo is not an executive authority.
محمود بدري.
اوكي. النموذج الثاني اللي هو النموذج الاقصاء الغير حكومي للشباب. هضرب 3 امثله. اول حاجه حزب الدستور اللي تم انشاؤه بغرض ايجاد تنظيم قوي للشباب بحيث ان هم يقدروا ينافسوا، وبالفعل الشباب اشتغلوا بشكل قوي ومحموم من اجل تاسيس الحزب. وفور تاسيس الحزب تم اقصاء كل القيادات الشابه واستدعاء حفريات تاريخيه تتولى قياده الحزب، تمام، وكل الشباب اللي اسسوا الحزب بقوا على جنب.
So in terms of non-government kind of marginalization, he's going to give 3 examples. The first one is the Dastur party, the party around al-Baradei. This was founded in part in a main sense, to both empower the youth and also to give them a leading role. But what actually happened is that they were consistently, all the young people who were involved were consistently marginalized, and it's like hafr
historical.
لا ناس historical people.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and so they're instead it's governed by people who are not young, who are older.
النموذج الثاني الغير حكومي بنتكلم حوالين تعامل جماعة الإخوان مع الشباب وإقصائهم ليها وإقصائها ليهم من إدارة المشهد، سواء اللي اختلفوا مع سياساتها فاترفدوا زي حالاتي، أو الشباب اللي كانوا موجودين داخل الجماعة وما زالوا في الجماعة حتى هذه اللحظة، ولكن كان دايما بيتم استخدام نغمة كويس إن أنتم ما عندكوش الخبرة اللي موجودة عند الناس إخوانكم الأكبر. وده سبب كارثة حقيقية للجماعة لأن هو قطع صلتها بالشارع الثوري، وبقى جسم الجماعة الضخم ده ليه عقل، هو بيفكر في وادي والشارع تحت بيغلي وبيتحرك في وادي تاني كويس، ويسبب جزء كبير من الأزمة اللي هم بيواجهوها حاليا سببها عدم الاعتماد على الشباب وعدم قراءة اللحظة تاريخيا بشكل جيد واستخدام الأدوات المناسبة اللي هي استخدام قوتهم الشبابية.
And then the second example is the Muslim Brotherhood, which consistently alienated and marginalized its youth members who were part of this kind of greater youth movement. And one of the things that they were constantly told was, you don't have experience. You don't have the experience necessary like us older folks. And what that ended up with is actually a cutting of the link between the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood and their link to the youth generation, who was the real engine behind the revolution originally. And this is one of the main causes of the crisis that the Muslim Brotherhood is in now, is their loss of a link to this young generation that is so important in the events today. And this stems from really the organization's misreading of the historical moment. They didn't read the historical moment correctly and understand the importance of the youth.
المشهد الثالث هو مشهد فريد ومهم جدا. في إحدى جلسات الحوار الوطني مع رئيس الجمهورية، هي في جلسة وحيدة جابت الإنقاذ وافت أن هي تحضرها. في هذه الجلسة أنا اقترحت بالنسبة لقانون الانتخابات إن هو ينص على أن يكون في الربع الأول من القائمة شاب وامرأة فقط، ما أقولش أي حاجة، يعني مجرد أن يبقى شاب وامرأة. ولأول مرة تتفق آراء الأحزاب السلفية والإخوان وجبهة الإنقاذ كلهم رفضوا.
The third example, which is really unique and important, is he experienced during one of the sessions of national dialogue that was held as tensions mounted, and he was present at this dialogue with the Muslim Brotherhood, the National Salvation Front, and the Salafis, and he put forth a suggestion when they were discussing electoral laws that when you have these parliamentary lists for different parties, that the first quarter of every list, the first 25%, consists only of youth and women.
No, just included, not consist. يعني just
included. Yeah, only be youth and women.
يعني among the 25%, put woman or a youth.
امرأة واحدة أو شاب واحد.
امرأة أو شاب رفض.
Okay, واحد, or you either in the first 25% you either have to have one woman or one youth. And this was fascinating because it was one of the few instances in which the Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafis, and the National Salvation Front all agreed, and they said no way.
Yeah. من ضمن الحاجات اللي حصلت بعد 3/7 وبعد الانقلاب ان هو حصل انعاش حقيقي للحركة الطلابية المصرية. الحقيقة الحركة الطلابية المصرية بعد 25 يناير كانت أصابها حالة من الفتور والتراجع لصالح التحركات الميدانية والمظاهرات في الشارع، وبالتالي كان الطلبة بيشاركوا في الشوارع وما فيش تحركات خاصة بالطلبة فقط. بعد الانقلاب وبشكل أكثر وضوحا بعد فض رابعة ومع بدايات العام الدراسي بدأت الحركة الطلابية المصرية تتبلور مرة أخرى وبتاخد القيادة في ارتفاع السقف، القيادة في القدرة على تقديم تضحيات، القيادة في تقديم نموذج حقيقي لإجراء مصالحة وطنية. يعني طلاب الجامعات من مختلف التيارات قدروا يتجاوزوا كل المشاكل الخلافية ويدركوا أن في لحظة تاريخية فارقة في حياة مصر، كلهم تنازلوا عن انتماءاتهم ومرجعياتهم وشغالين لهدف واحد وهو الحصول على الحرية ومحاولة إضعاف أو إسقاط الانقلاب العسكري، بغض النظر هم يقدروا يعملوها ولا لا.
So another really important thing that's happened since the 3rd of July coup and the breakup of the protests at Rabaa was that the student movement in Egypt really kind of gained second wind, or sort of has been revived. After the January 25th protests, the student movements, specifically in universities, had become weak and complacent. A lot of the revolutionary activity had shifted onto the streets. But after the real repression started in this summer, and then when the school year started in September, really you saw a return of these student movements, revitalized, and that they're
leading.
Yeah, I'm just trying. Oh, they've crystallized once again and are playing a leading role in picking up this sort of revolutionary movement. And there's sort of trying to present a notion of really unified national well-being and a future for Egypt that is concerned with the welfare of all Egyptians. They sort of understand this is a really crucial historical moment for Egypt, and so the people involved in the student movement are really setting aside everything they're doing, and they're just working solely for this unified goal of achieving freedom and defeating the coup government.
أحد برضو الحاجات المشاهد اللي حصلت بعد انقلاب 3/7 فيما يخص التحركات النسائية أو النسوية في الشارع. الحقيقة بعد ثورة يناير كان كله ملاحظ ان بقى فيه مشاركة اكتر من السيدات، وان هم كانوا دور فاعل، السيدات والفتيات كانوا ليهم دور فاعل ومؤثر في 25 يناير وما تلاها، ولكن من ضمن الجماهير. الحقيقة الفترة الأخيرة شهدت حاجة غريبة جدا، ان السيدات والفتيات بدأوا هم يشكلوا تحركات ويقودوها، وفي البعض منها بدأت التحركات اللي بدأت نسوية ينضم إليها عدد من الشباب والرجال بدون أي حساسية، تمام، وكلهم يتحركوا في الشارع مطالبين بمزيد من الحرية أو الديمقراطية. نموذج بسيط للحركات دي حركة لطيفة جدا اسمها حركة 7 الصبح. حركة 7 الصبح دي مجموعة من البنات كانوا إلى حد ما خايفين من الضرب والقلق، فقرروا إن هم هينزلوا بدري وهي الناس رايحة الشغل، يقفوا بشكل سلمي شايلين بلالين، تمام، وواقفين في الشارع، واللي يسألهم يقولوا له إيه اللي حصل. ففي أول يوم حصل دون كويس، الأمن ما فهمش إيه اللي بيحصل، ولا بنات معاهم بلالين وعليها إشارة رابعة، فقبض عليهم وحولهم للمحاكمة، واتحكم على كل بنت منهم ب11 سنة. الموضوع كان صادم، حصل ضغوط، وفي جلسة الاستئناف كلهم خدوا براءة كويس، وده طبعا يقول لنا القضاء نزيه قد ايه. المهم الحركة دي هي كانت حركة يوم واحد، بس بعد ما خرجوا من السجن بقت حركة حقيقية، وبقى في تقريبا بشكل شبه اسبوعي في مظاهرات ضخمة بتنظمها حركة 7 الصبح، مليانة رجالة وستات وسلفيين وبنات كويس. وده بيدي فكرة حوالين الدور اللي ممكن تلعبه المرأة والفتاة المصرية في المستقبل، وان هو ممكن يكون ليها دور قيادي وريادي في إعادة تشكيل المجتمع المصري. وانا حتى كنت لسه بتكلم مع احد الاصدقاء قبل السيشن اللي فات، فبيقول لي ان هو من وجهة نظره ان التأسيس الثالث لجماعة الاخوان المسلمين، وانا بتكلم على جماعة دينية محافظة، تمام، هيكون على ايد الستات. يعني التأسيس الاول عمله حسن البنا، والتأسيس الثاني على ايد الطلبة، التأسيس الثالث للاخوان بعد الازمة دي اكشولي هيكون على ايد الفتيات والستات المنضمين للاخوان المسلمين.
يعني ايش البلالين؟
بلالين بالونز.
اوكي. ماشي. ليش؟ عشان خايفين من الضرب؟ عشان
لا، هم كانوا بينزلوا 7 الصبح 7 AM. اوكي. عشان يبعدوا عن اي احتكاكات مع الامن.
فهمت.
كويس.
Okay. So one really important thing that's happened since this last stage of in Egypt's what's been happening since the summer is the emergence of women and as real actors. Before, in the January 2011 revolution, there'd been a lot of participation by women, and this was noted and noticed, but they were part of other organizations. What you've seen in the last couple of months is women actually stepping forth and forming and leading movements. Some of them later have men joining these women's movements without any sense of awkwardness or questioning that. A good example of this is what's called the 7 a.m. movement, Harakat 7 Subh, and these are a number of young women who, in order to avoid any problem with the police, they would go out at 7 a.m. and they would have balloons and they would go and walk the streets, kind of a form of peaceful protest against what was happening. The police noticed this, then of course they arrested them and they were tried and they were given 11 years in prison. But on appeal, they were freed. And then he made a joke about something about
free, independent judges.
Independent judges, but to what extent? And then actually when they came out of prison, this movement actually became more famous and started getting a lot of members, many of them men. And this has resulted in a moment where Egyptian women now see the potential really to have more of a leadership role in these youth movements. And he suggests that the third revival or the third founding of the Muslim Brotherhood will actually take place at the hands of women. It will be done by women. The first founding done by Hassan al-Banna, the second one by the youth in the universities in the 1970s, and the third one he's suggesting would be done by women in Egypt.
من المهم ايضا ان احنا نرصد بعض التحولات التي حدثت. اول حاجه بنرصدها هي انسحاب الشباب من التنظيمات والاحزاب والائتلافات وعودتهم الى العمل الفردي مره اخرى. تاني حاجه ان في مجموعات من الشباب بدأت تتجه لتكوين تيارات تتبنى العمل المسلح لاستهداف الكيانين المسلحين في مصر اللي هم الجيش والشرطة. والحقيقة ان هم بيقدموا نموذج مختلف عن نموذج الجماعات الإسلامية التقليدي، يعني فكرة العنف لترويع المجتمع وترويع الدولة، لا هم بيعملوا عنف موجه تجاه أشخاص بعينهم، تجاه حاجات معينة، لا يقوموا بإزهاق أرواح. يمكن السلوجان كانوا مطلعين سلوجان لطيف ان هو كل ما دون القتل سلمية. ثالث حاجة طبعا ان بدأ يظهر للأسف حالات فردية لانتقام من بعض أفراد الشرطة ومن البلطجية اللي بيساعدوهم وبيستهدفوا ممتلكاتهم. الحاجة الرابعة هو بداية ظهور وتبلور تيار مسيحي شبابي غير راضي بالأداء السياسي للكنيسة وغير راضي بالدور اللي بيقوم به البابا الإسكندرية. التيار ده ما زال ضعيف ولكنه آخذ بالتبلور، وأنا بقول إنه كويس لأن هو هيعمل معادلة مع الصقور الموجودين داخل الكنيسة حاليا، وقد يؤدي في المستقبل لإحداث نوع من أنواع التوازن.
So there's a number of other important transformations he wanted to point out. The first one is the phenomenon of the youth really pulling out of organizations and for activism and engaging more in independent individual work. The second one is the formation of armed gangs of youth, but their intention is to face the state and defend themselves against the state and defend other youth against the state. So it's not the kind of violence that we saw with Islamist organizations, let's say in the 1990s, were interested in your dramatic acts of violence. It's more the potential for violence to face, to match the violence carried out by the security services. Yeah, targeted violence. بس هو ايش المقولة اللي
كل ما دون القتل سلمية.
Yeah, okay. everything
less than killing is peaceful.
So everything less than killing is peaceful. Then there's a phenomenon of the revenge, sort of maybe an extension of that is revenge attacks against individuals from the security services, the police, and also against Baltagia, who are sort of thugs who are on the payroll of the government but are not in uniform. And then finally, last phenomenon, or the emergence of groups of young Christian youth, Coptic Christians, who are not happy with the pro-government stance of the church, and sort of this movement is still small and forming, but he thinks that it's possible that in the future it will be a real counterpart to the government cooperation that you see and the silence that you see as an official church position.
النقطة الأخيرة اللي أحب أختم بيها إنه هو بعد تعرض 6 فتيات للاغتصاب وفقا لتقرير مركز هشام مبارك للقانون، تعرضهم للاغتصاب في أقسام البوليس أثناء احتجازهم، وبعد تخوين شباب الثورة، وبعد القبض ومطاردة ومنع دخول مصر لكل من كان ينادي بالتغيير السلمي وبسياسات اللا عنف من أجل التغيير الديمقراطي. بقول بعد ما حصل ده كله بقى في جيل صغير أصغر في السن عنده 12 و13 و14 سنة بيبص لكل اللي بيقول بالسلمية على إنه ساذج وهبل، وطبيعي بعد ما يغيب في السجن كل اللي بينادوا بالعمل السلمي وبنبذ العنف هيجي الجيل اللي شايف إن العنف دون فخر وإنه أسلوب للحياة، خصوصا لما تيجي تصدر للناس فكرة إن اللي بيملك البندقية هو اللي بيقرر مصير الدولة، تمام، وإن أصوات الناس مش هي المحك ولكن إرادة جنرالات البيزنس هي اللي بتحدد مصير الدولة.
So one last point is that after a lot of really horrible events like the rape of 6 girls and في حاجة حصلت في محطة الأمن.
They were captured in the police station and 6 of them separately.
These 6 girls were raped in the police station, and then the exile, the the government prohibiting many people who had been calling for peaceful change, who had been outside of Egypt, from returning to Egypt. He feels that there's a younger generation, people who are 12, 13, 14 years old, who are looking at all these events and saying, peace is, anybody who's calling for peace and peaceful means is naive. That, peaceful measures are naive, and that the person who has a gun, he's the person who decides the fate of the country. And democracy doesn't count, the voice of the people doesn't count, what counts is having a gun. And that this is, might be one of the results of these transformations. Thank you. Thank you very much.